at the right hour on the right day for a conversation.
Wearing clearly different colored shirts, which is another rarity.
Yes,
usually
no one is wearing our standard issue blue Oxford. That is the the uniform of choice here in Washington, D.C. So we are really glad to be having today as our special guest, an old friend and someone I think both Elon and I really look up to and respect very deeply, the former Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, and someone that has a resume that is so incredibly polished and wonderful. I won't run through all of the different pieces, but this is a lot better for me, Elon, than some of the conversations that we've been having. I think when Wendy leaves in about half an hour, we're going to recount some of the conversations you and I have been in recently. But I was on stage in New York City with Bret Stephens, and that was a different conversation.
Yeah, and I was on Pod Save America last week, and what would have been 10 years ago a really easy conversation where everybody would agree, and now is I think a lot more complicated.
Yeah, it's a lot, Wendy. It is not easy holding this middle ground. You try, as you well know, and so we're definitely going to get into that a little bit here. And so thanks again to everybody for joining us, and we're going to get going here. And as I said, we're joined by Ambassador Wendy Sherman, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, but I think as important as anything in her bio is having been the lead negotiator for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, as people refer to it more colloquially. And I think there's really just nobody better, Elon, to discuss the issues of the day with than Ambassador Sherman. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
So no, Wendy, and thank you for really joining us for this. Let's start really simply on Iran. Where do you think we are right now? Where do you see this all going?
I think we're in a really tough place right now. I think we're in a bit of a stalemate or a disequilibrium. Iran has said the blockade has to end, then they might open the strait, but how they'll open it and whether they'll ask for sanctions relief or ending their frozen assets or tolling people coming through the strait. And only after that and the end of the war, they will talk about nuclear issues, which ostensibly is what President Trump cares about the most. The President Trump, on the other hand, has said he's going to keep the blockade going. He may even take some selected strikes against infrastructure in hopes that Iran will blink. And as he said today, we'll give in. Well, this has been the problem from the start, Elon, which you and Jeremy understand really well. Iran, for them, this is existential. They're not going to give in. And there are core issues to their identity, their sovereignty, and their sense of resistance, which is part of the culture. That means they can outlast us, unfortunately, which means Americans are going to have their gas prices as they are today, higher than they've been in 4 years. That's probably going to continue. Very tough time for us. And the rest of the world has it even worse, particularly in Europe and Asia.
So what's your best guess on, this is where we're stuck. What's your best guess on how this ends, or if it ends, or if this goes on for a while?
How do we get out of the cul-de-sac?
Basically, how do you see the best way? Well, there's the best way forward, and then there's what's going to actually happen.
Right. If we had some really creative negotiators and people who understood Iran, which so far I haven't seen at our side of the negotiating table, as much as the vice president is a learned man and Witkoff and Kushner may be great businessmen. I'm not sure any of them understand Iran. So if we were being creative, you might say, all right, why don't you, Iran, suspend your hold on the Strait of Hormuz during a ceasefire and a negotiation, and we will suspend the blockade. Now, they might ask for something, we might ask for something, but creating a space for negotiations. I don't think that will happen. I don't think either the Trump administration, which believes they can outweigh Iran, or Iran, which believes it can outweigh the US, would do that. But that would be a creative one of many creative ways forward. What I think will happen is President Trump will keep trying to push Iran thinking they can get them to blink, that they'll run out of storage for their oil, that they'll run out of storage for gas, that the economic price will be too high, while the economic price for the world economy is also extremely high. Interesting today that President Trump had a 90-minute phone call with Putin. Oh, wouldn't we have loved to have listened in on that call? Worries me because he could open up the pipeline of Russia, which would help Russia with Ukraine, but might bring the price of oil down. He could do all kinds of deals with Russia, and that would be foolhardy on his part because Russia's all in for Iran.
So let me take you back. One of the things that drives me nuts is when people say, well, Iran is a bad actor and it had a nuclear program and we needed to do something. So at least President Trump did something, and that's a good thing. The thing that actually was done and that worked is the deal that you negotiated. And for 3+ years, we had a world in which Iran was a year away from having the nuclear material in order to potentially create a bomb. And I, to this day, think that the deal that you struck was a spectacular deal. And from the point of view of nuclear nonproliferation, was one of the strongest deals, if not the strongest nonproliferation deal ever negotiated. And I'm curious your thoughts. Now we're about 11 years on from that. When Democrats were going about the job of trying to defend the deal and sell the deal, I heard over and over again, all right, it's not the greatest deal. Oh, we could have had a better deal. All of these things that were said about the deal that I think created an atmosphere that when Trump pulled out of the deal, it almost seemed like the logical thing to do since it wasn't that great a deal. And I'm curious your perspective on the whole approach that Democrats took to selling the deal back in the day and what it says about our approach as Democrats to foreign policy generally and the confidence one has to act with.
It's a really, really good question, Jeremy. I've thought about it a whole lot. First of all, I want to say I'm really proud of the fact that I led the day-to-day team, but that deal wouldn't have been possible without President Barack Obama and Secretary John Kerry, Secretary Hillary Clinton,
Right.
Secretary Ernie Moniz, and hundreds of people in the US government. It was an extraordinary effort, including our intelligence community, Treasury, our national labs. I could go on. So I really want people to understand what an effort this was, what the infrastructure was to achieve what was achieved. Now, at the time, we had a lot of critics. People didn't think that the deal kept Iran in a box for long enough. And certainly they believed not forever. I believed it kept Iran in the box for at least 15 years, and I think perhaps longer for reasons not worth going into right here. But what it did give us, as you pointed out, was a year. And if somehow they managed to get past the intrusive monitoring and verification to cheat, we would have time to take military action or to go back to the negotiating table. Now, it is true that this regime is terrible. And what has happened as a result of this war is it's more terrible. It's more hardline than it was when we were negotiating. And it has constrained the space of the Iranian people even more, exactly against what President Trump originally said, which is he was taking action to have the backs of the Iranian people, protesters who had been slaughtered, thousands and thousands in the streets. The regime is even worse now. So we are not in the same place. Iran has probably 11 tons of fissile material. Probably 1,000 pounds of that is 60% enriched uranium. That may be underground right now, but nonetheless, it's still in Iran. They have greater knowledge, greater capability. They still have missiles. They still have fast boats. They still have drones. They now have a land trail that Pakistan has set up for them as another way to get their oil out and other commodities. So we're in a very, very tough place.
Yeah, and I will say for me, two other things that I always think about when I think about the JCPOA is one is this criticism of, oh, it would have expired and they could do whatever they want. Nuclear deals and various agreements oftentimes have expirations and sunsets, and if things are working, you negotiate a follow-on deal. From a much, I could imagine if you did the JCPOA for 10 or 15 years and at some point decided you wanted to relook at certain things, certainly it would be easier than the negotiation we're trying to have right now in the aftermath of a war and years of both sides not believing, especially the Iranians not believing that the US will actually live up to its end of any deal that it strikes. So that's one thing. The other thing that also really gets to me is, if you remember, and I'm interested in your take on this, President Obama used to talk a lot about this is a choice between this deal and war, and it would drive the opponents crazy. They would say, no, it's between this and a better deal, and we don't want a war. And all those same people who were saying that are now sitting there cheerleading what Donald Trump is doing, which has really made me reevaluate, or maybe we knew all along what their actual position was. But I'm interested in your take on that.
Your point is really well taken, Elon. We always said to folks in Congress, there's a choice between diplomacy and trying to negotiate an agreement and war. And people said exactly what you just said. That's not true. We can get a better deal. But we're seeing how hard that is. And it's much, much harder now, even though our military has been fantastic. There's no question that we have conventional capabilities that have limited their missile program, limited their enrichment program, limited their Navy, et cetera, et cetera. But they still have a lot of capacity. They are still a culture of resistance. We cannot bomb away knowledge. We have to get back to a negotiating table, because once you start a war, as we all have seen, you've got to think about the second and the third and the fourth things that might happen as a result of that war. And we're all seeing them now. We are seeing the Middle East, which you all understand better than I do, the Middle East fall apart. Things change. The UAE has pulled out of OPEC because it wants to control its own quotas. So the Middle East is going to be changed forever. The world is being changed forever. So I'm not for Iran. I don't trust Iran. This regime is awful. But the way that President Trump is going about this is not going to get the result he wants.
So I wanted to just dig in a little bit on your experience having dealt with the Iranians. I think it's unique and fascinating for all of us. You mentioned that for all we might respect the background of the vice president and the business dealings of Trump aides like Kushner and Witkoff, there's no expertise in having dealt with Iran. And you really have dealt, you've spent years across the table from them. What do you think the American policymakers, politicians, commentators don't understand about Iran? What are some of the most important lessons that you take from that direct experience that you think people are just missing?
Well, as I said earlier, Iran is a culture of resistance. The 1979 revolution was about resistance. As I think you know, in 1953, the United States intelligence community and the British intelligence community worked together to depose the legitimate prime minister, Mossadegh, of Iran, and put in the Shah of Iran, who was good for the West, but was horribly oppressive. And that oppression led to the revolution in 1979. Ever since, this has been a theologically driven radical Islamic republic. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force, their very hardline military, has gained greater and greater control. And right now, I believe, is in control of the decisions that are being made. I believe that Mushtaba, the new supreme leader, is alive, but he is in his position because the IRGC put him there. Even his father wasn't sure he was the right person to be the next supreme leader. So I think we need to understand they went through an Iran-Iraq war and they hung in there for 8 years, even
Right.
though they were losing. They have tremendous ability to sustain pain. Secondly, I would say they are superb negotiators and strategists. The foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was my counterpart during the negotiations. He's very smart. His English is excellent. He understands media quite well. He's very strategic. He has revolutionary bona fides. And look at what he's doing. He's doing diplomacy. He went to Russia, to Oman. He's caught Qatar. He's caught Saudi Arabia. He is trying to build his network of support for the positions that Iran has. We need to be doing the same.
So let me transition. We're probably about halfway through the time we have with you, and really, really value all of your experience on Iran. But I do want to shift a little bit into the Israeli-Palestinian realm and U.S. policy. And one of the things I think most people watching this are probably aware of, because it did make a bit of a splash, is some of the comments that you've made in recent days about what Israel did and where we are in Gaza. And I sort of frame that you and I have been in relationship over a couple of decades about these issues and talked about American policy towards Israel in the context of many different presidential campaigns and the creation of democratic platforms, and how should the political world navigate this really difficult waters. And it certainly is more difficult than it's ever been. And the situation on the ground is worse than it's ever been. And you have really staked out what, from my experience with you over the years, is a very, strong and bold stance now, which is very critical publicly of what happened. Can you tell those who are watching what you've said recently? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to let you, say
Sure.
what you want to say about what Israel has done and what you think that does for the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Sure. So October 7th was horrifying and really reinforced the feeling I'm sure every person in Israel has, which is the existential reality that there are people, Hamas certainly, and Iran, that wants to see the end of Israel. I believe in Israel. I believe in the need for a Jewish state. I believe that it is critical to end the terror that is in front of Israelis day in and day out. And I believe that the Netanyahu government's response to that horrible day was not just to go into Gaza and root out Hamas, but to really end the Palestinian people's ability to live in Gaza. Now, I used that word in an interview I did, genocide, which got a lot of reaction. But legal analysts have indeed, I'm not a lawyer, have indeed said that what occurred did meet that definition. But regardless of whether you use the word genocide or not, it was horrible. And I understood wanting to root out Hamas. And I know Hamas sometimes uses citizens as a front, as a shield. I get all of that. But what happened under the Netanyahu administration was really to slaughter a people. And we've heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu all kinds of statements that lead one to believe that he wants to annex the West Bank, taking away and further constricting the space that Palestinians have. I believe Israel will never be secure if it keeps pushing so that the Palestinians disappear, because it will create a new generation of terrorists that will come after Israel. And so it breaks my heart. And I know that people that are under the age of 45 or maybe even 50 often don't even call themselves Zionists anymore, because they believe what has occurred by the prime minister's leadership has not been good for the Jewish people. So I want and do support Israel, and I support a Jewish state, but I also believe that the Palestinians should have dignity and their own ability to live in a place they can call home and have peace and security as well.
Yeah, and Wendy, I couldn't agree more with that. And that's obvious. That's where, obviously where I am and been going, for a long time. And also, one of the things that was striking to me in your comments, and generally, I think a shift in approach, I think in some ways from where you might have talked about this a few years ago, it's not that dissimilar from two communities that you and I are both part of, right? One is policymakers, the national security world, kind of people who view it. I often view this, I'm sure you do, this topic through the way you just look at foreign policy challenges and how you deal with it. And you've seen a big shift, I think, in amongst policymakers and in that community, especially folks who would, I say, call themselves Democrats and align with working in previous Democratic administrations. And at the same time, there's also been this big evolution in the American Jewish community over the last couple of years, as we've all reflected on this. And something you've also talked about in the past is how painful and challenging it was, the Iran debate was in the American Jewish community, and having all these organizations and individuals come at a deal that was so central, and you being very much in the middle of all that. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit just about your own evolutionary process on this and dealing with this with policymakers and with American Jews, and how this has all felt and the kind of conversations you've been having that have brought you here.
Yeah, it was very tough during the JCPOA. I was often on calls with rabbis, with leaders in the community. I spoke with every major Jewish organization in this country. And I knew that at the end of the day, some of the people that I was closest to were not going to be for the deal. Democrats, not just Republicans. And I knew that even though we consulted with Israel all throughout the negotiations, there was nothing they did not know. I went to Israel, they came here, we had a consultative group, we shared every single thing, often on secure video conferences. I knew at the end of the day that Prime Minister Netanyahu, as Prime Minister then as well, would probably not agree with the deal because Israel's interests were different than the United States. It is existential for Israel. It is not in the same way for us, not yet anyway, and we should never get there, of course. So I knew there were going to be differences. It was painful. The first place I went after I left as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs was to the INSS conference in Israel and spoke about the JCPOA. And I can't tell you the number of people who came up to me afterwards and said, I never really understood that. I never heard that from the government. I didn't understand the pieces of this, but it is what it is. Now, I have evolved in my own thinking. I have watched what has happened. I am post-ambition, so it's easier for me to speak about these things than it is for others. And I think back to my parents' generation, listening to my generation about the Vietnam War. I protested every week when I was in Boston, at Boston University, where I was for my last 2 years, against the Vietnam War. And I know the older generation didn't agree, but they heard us over time. And I have met with lots of young people. I spend a lot of time with young people at Harvard Kennedy School, with my own daughter and her peers. And I've tried to listen to where young Jewish leaders are. And that is now where I am too.
And, one of the things that I think is so difficult, and it leads into the conversation we're going to have after you leave us, which is having this conversation with the older generation and the more established part of the community, and having the ability to say this isn't about getting that younger generation to understand, and we need better hasbara to help them understand the history. This is a moral issue at this point.
Yes.
It's about how the Jewish people and the state of the Jewish people act with power against those who don't have power. And that, if there's anything that's central to ethics of every people, it's learning how to use power wisely and to help those who don't have it when it is not necessarily in your own interest even. And in this case, it's so in Israel's interest to ensure that the people who don't have the power get freedom and get self-determination, because there won't be security without Palestinian freedom. And so I guess the question, that I'm left with is, as we bring this back into a political lens for 2026 and 2028, and the Democratic Party is being rent asunder by these divisions within its own ranks, how can a Democratic candidate craft a message that is grounded in our values, that is grounded in everybody's self-interest, that can reach some of these audiences and convince them it doesn't mean we're against you, we're actually for you? And I'm curious your thing. You've worked on crafting the Democratic message for quite a while on these issues, and I'm curious your thinking heading into the next round of major elections.
Well, first of all, I'm really glad that J Street is engaged in thinking through this, because I don't think it's easy. And it's a core message. I think you put it really well, Jeremy. It's about morals. It's about values. It's about human life. And it's gotten more complicated because where we are in the politics in our own country and the leadership in our own country. We all have just witnessed the King of England give, I thought, an extraordinary speech in Congress in a joint meeting where he subtly reminded everybody of what our values are and who we are as people. And that is what I think does have to be front and center. So I agree with you. It's not teaching the younger generation. My grandsons are still going to Sunday school. They're still hearing everything that I heard, if not more. They're still going to get bar mitzvahed. But their sense of what Israel is about and what the Jewish community stands for, oh my goodness, we have to stand for freedom. We have to stand for equity. We have to stand for peace and security. And it has to be our values front and center. And those values front and center, I think, will also help us with what is absolutely a scourge of anti-Semitism, which we all need to work on, but make sure that anti-Semitism isn't used as a weapon as well, which I believe at times this administration has done. So who we are and what the bedrock of who we are will help us get through this very complex time.
Yeah, and I think it's going to have to be the big challenge that we're going to have, and Jeremy and I will talk about it a little bit after you hop off too, is this challenge of we're finally having that honest and direct debate about it doesn't have to be a blank check, and supporting Israel is not just supporting the Israeli government and doing everything that they want us to do. That is not what you do to support friends, not if you really care, especially when the things they're doing are violating your own values and American interests, right?
Yeah.
Even at a more just realpolitik kind of. But the one challenge we are also going to have is we have folks who are really throwing up their hands and saying, well, forget it. We just need to walk away from this altogether. We need to just walk away from Israel altogether. That's the best option here. Embargoes and boycotts and forget it. And that doesn't really work either. I don't really think that will work as a message for Democrats, but I also think it's just bad policy and and won't actually get Palestinians what we want them to have, which is that freedom and equality too.
I agree. We can't walk away from Israel. There's a reason that Israel came into existence. That reason has not gone away. We are in a situation where we need to talk about this. We need to be honest about it. I think J Street's been supporting some efforts, as you say, not to give a blank check to any of our friends and allies, but to nonetheless have those friends and allies. And look, I think even though I'm a Democrat, I supported the Abraham Accords, which was an effort to try to bring everybody together and get everybody on the same page. But that's been disrupted in really powerful ways. We're not going to get back to that moment, but we need to figure out what we can build to ensure Israel's security, but to make sure that Palestinians have the same kind of security, the same kind of dignity. And, you know, everybody says you cannot equate one against the other. That's not what I'm doing. That's not what you're doing. But we have to be for people having an identity, a home, dignity, and peace. We have to be.
Amen. And that is the role of the United States, to try to help these two peoples to build that future. And it's in our interest. It's in our national security interest to help both of those people achieve that goal. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
To Ambassador Wendy Sherman. It's wonderful to have you here. We're going to stay on, Elon and I, and chat a little bit. And thank you again to Wendy. It's great to see you.
Wendy.
Thank you. Great to see you all. Bye-bye.
And for all of you out there who are watching Word on the Street Live, please do give us a heart, like the conversation, tell your friends about these weekly conversations that we have with really incredible people. I mean, Wendy is certainly one of my heroes. She is such a thoughtful, soft-spoken person with a backbone of steel, with a heart of gold, with a set of values. I mean, she is precisely the best of what it means to be in public service and in the nation's service. And so I just am so glad we had a chance to have the conversation with her. You had a chance to serve with her, correct?
Yeah, I did. Well, actually, I did work for her a little bit when I was working for Martin Indyk, and Wendy was a very senior official in the administration on Israeli-Palestinian issues, and had opportunities to brief her, and never worked directly for her, which is, you know, an unfortunate regret, but always just deeply respected her. And she was always was in a lot of rooms with her on very difficult conversations and very difficult debates. And she, you know, most of the time agreed. Sometimes you disagree, but always respected what she brought to the table in a very, very impressive way. And very, like you said, backbone of steel, and very effective at pushing things forward, which is just so important in government.
And the other thing, you know, that I think is important for younger women who looked for role models in national security world, in diplomacy, in public service, Wendy Sherman came into public service working for Barbara Mikulski, you know, the most long-serving woman in the United States Senate. She worked for Madeleine Albright, the first woman as Secretary of State. She worked then for Hillary Clinton. I mean, she was a pioneer and surrounded by and supporting and then leading the infusion of women into diplomacy and into our State Department and public service. And it's an infusion we need more of. You know, when I look at those tables and I see, you know, you've got Witkoff, Kushner, Vance sitting across from a bunch of you know, men on the Iranian side, and in the middle of negotiations that were never well thought out, you just start bombing anyway. I just think the thing that's missing in the midst of all this is we need women in the picture. And I just am so depressed when I look at these rooms and all that I see are men around these tables, and the you know, the leaning in on the militarization and the military as the answer. Boy, you know, do we need a Wendy Sherman right now?
I mean, I kind of look at that. I look at the Israeli mentality sometimes when I talk to my Israeli colleagues and Israeli national security and foreign policy officials. And so much of that is driven by, you know, men who are retired, senior, or, you know, official, like military, because the whole Israeli mentality and national security system is so based on the IDF. And especially when I was actually in my previous job at CNAS, and I just got to go over to Israel and just talk to experts. It was just kind of being nerdy, wonky, kind of pushing for better policies. Like, all my favorite counterparts were women. who had just like a much more thoughtful, nuance. You look at the role Tzipi Livni is playing right now in Israeli politics, and what she is saying about Israeli foreign policy, and we actually have to have a political objective that goes with the military objective and try to actually unify that. And that's a position. I mean, one other thing I'll say about Wendy is she's a trailblazer in all kinds of different ways. I can't think of somebody who's as senior as her, as a former government official, who's come out and used the genocide word. Like she, even this long into it, it's also pretty bold. And, so I respect that. Even if I don't, that word it's very complicated, as you and I both spend a lot of time talking.
So we discussed a little bit during the course of the conversation with Wendy, some of the experiences we've had in the past week. And, I don't know whether or not my conversation with Bret Stephens is available online. I'm not positive about that, but, I had this conversation in New York with him about primarily the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We never really had the chance to get into the Iran issue. And you also had a conversation on Pod Save America, and it just is interesting. The space that you and I and Jay Stewart are trying to carve out is a sensible middle ground on these issues. Yeah. And there are times when I wonder, maybe this is, all a chimera. Maybe there is no middle ground. When you sit with a Bret Stephens on the one side and some of the folks at Pod Save on the other, you end up thinking, wow, nobody wants to give an inch. But at the same time, I really feel that when we argue with a Bret Stephens and say, no, there actually are Palestinians for us to talk to, and he's just dismissive of the entirety of the Palestinian population, or there's folks who just want to walk away from Israel, like on Pod Save. I think we really are in the right place.
Yeah, no, and look, the conversation with Tommy Vitor on Pod Save America, and I should say Tommy, I thought incredibly reasonable, and sometimes asking the hard questions, but asking them from his audience, which is a different set of questions, obviously, than Bret Stephens, right? Like 10 years ago, if you had gone on Pod Save America, that would have been a really easy conversation. We are totally aligned on all the things. Now it's a lot more complicated given the debate inside the Democratic Party. And I've thought a lot about that interview. I wrote a piece about it today, and there's really two things.
Really urge people to read it. It was a really good piece.
There's two things that I have come back to. The first is J Street is not calling for the same old peace process. Really important. The middle that we are arguing for is fundamentally different than where things were 5 or 10 years ago, right? I mean, we are arguing for conditioning aid to Israel based on its behavior. We are calling for cutting off certain arms. We are calling for changing the way. We're calling for an end to just a negotiation where the U.S. just backs the Israeli position and is the sole arbiter. We're calling for phasing out, the financial subsidy that Israel gets from the United States. We're calling for, sanctions on extremist violent settlers in the West Bank. None of these things are the old peace process of 5 or 10 years ago. It is the middle of the Democratic Party. We are the middle, and we're the middle of the Jewish community. But we have to understand that this has never been tried before, what we are calling for. And at the same time, the answer can't be, let's just punish Israel or walk away from Israel or, give up on this whole problem altogether because it's too hard. We really need to, it feels good to just say, okay, let's do an arms embargo and let's do BDS, not engage. But the people we need to be engaging with are the Israeli and the Palestinian peacemakers in both of those societies. And those people exist, and they still make up huge portions of those societies. They're not in the ascendancy right now, but we need to help them become the ascendant ones. And they work together and they build on each other. And that's so much of the work that we do here when we take delegations, to Israel and Palestine. Like, this is the kind of stuff we are doing, as opposed to, the extremists on both sides. When Bibi Netanyahu and Hamas, they build off each other too. It's the Hamas bombings in the 90s that lead to Bibi's ascendance, and really was the beginning of the end of Oslo, right? It was Bibi who was allowing billions of dollars to fly in cash, land in Ben Gurion Airport, and be driven into Gaza while he was cutting the knees off of the Palestinian Authority by withholding all their funds. He was doing the same thing. He was helping the extremists and hurting the moderates. And so we need not allow the argument to become inside the Democratic Party, if we just punish Israel enough, then somehow things will change for Palestinians without actually creating an environment that works for both. So that's the case I think I'm going to want to make. But I'm interested, Jeremy, on your side, right? As we talked about, these debates are always harder than when you just get to do it yourself or be in a, just get all your points out there. But you found the conversation with Bret Stephens to be challenging too. And by the way, doing it at the Stryker Center, for folks who don't know what the Stryker Center is, this is one of the premier venues Jewish venues in New York. Maybe it's the premier Jewish venue in New York in terms of bringing together high-level conversations. I mean, the fact that you were there, leading an event, in my mind, is the biggest victory of all in all this. But how did you see it?
Well, I mean, one of the things that was very frustrating was when Bret and the moderator also seemed to be surprised that I found it novel and surprising that I was there. And they were like, "Oh, we always have these conversations. It's no problem at all." It is impossible to open up many, many venues, whether it is synagogues or it's Hillels or it's federations. And I just got booted from a country club that, I was going to have a little reception at a country club here in the DC area. And they said, the board voted unanimously to say, no, we can't, J Street's not welcome at our country club. I mean, it is absolutely amazing how shut down the institutions and the leadership of the Jewish community, institutional established Jewish community, are to hearing not just a moderate liberal Jewish voice, but God forbid we should actually hear from Palestinians. I mean, that's the thing that is also really missing in this conversation, is that the Jewish community has all these statements that they want to make about Palestinians, but then they don't allow Palestinians in the door to speak for themselves. And I find that to be one of the most troubling things as well. And so it is very, we're still not in a great place with the American Jewish established community as to how we have this conversation. And again, it's the younger generation that is pushing the envelope, and they don't have the institutional power yet to change the way that a lot of these institutions work. I did want to sort of wrap us up here by bringing into the conversation one other thing I'm going to write a little bit about this weekend, I think, which is a visit this week that was on Israeli TV by some of the older national security veterans, including
post-ambition.
Post-ambition. I love that term, to be post-ambition. So the former head of the Mossad, the former commander of the Central Command of the IDF, a couple of other very significant former, I think maybe even one of the former IDF chiefs of staff, went on a tour of the West Bank, particularly in Area C, to see some of the Palestinian villages that have been coming under an onslaught from the terrorists of the Jewish settlement in the area, and some of the things that Tamir Pardo, the Mossad former Mossad director, he was the Mossad director in the Netanyahu era between 2011 and 2015. He was the head of the Mossad.
He was the head of the Mossad when Wendy Sherman was negotiating the JCPOA. They were having very hard conversations.
Right. We're not talking about a lefty peacenik here, but having him look at this and say that it made him ashamed, and it shamed his Jewish identity, and he wondered how people who had been through the Holocaust could be associated with this kind of activity. This is just not seen on Israeli national television. It isn't seen by the American Jewish leadership. This is who we need speaking out. And so these post-ambition leaders, and I wrote about it a little bit this past week. I'm going to write about it again, because I think there's nothing more important than for us to get the message out that the people who have been responsible for Israel's survival and for its security for decades and for generations are now looking at what is happening and say, this is indefensible. So I found that very moving.
Yeah, no, I agree. And he's part of a group now, Commanders for Israel Security, we've talked about before, I think, on the show, if not, J Street works closely with, of people who are making this point again and again. They also I worked with them a lot 10 years ago on a project which, when we put out a long paper in my old job about what does a security system look like for the two-state solution that could actually work, and their view is it can work, and there are technical solutions for all these problems, and we developed and put those out there. And so we need to keep listening and engaging to that particular audience and talking to them. I mean, and one of the dangers,
because security, I mean, the word security is the absolute key to get people to actually listen.
Yeah, and one of the challenges and dangers we do have now, and I remember having this conversation 10 years ago with one of the co-authors in this paper, ICYMI, who was a 2-star general. He was talking about how the difference now is who serves in the IDF, who stays on and becomes an officer in the IDF is changing. And it used to be that this was the liberal Zionists.
Right. And this was where you made your career. This was what you wanted to do as a career.
Exactly. Now the folks from Tel Aviv, they head off to a startup.
Exactly.
Pretty quickly. And it's the national religious, right?
Who stay.
It's the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir voters who stay. And increasingly you see them moving into more senior, they become colonels and they become generals. And that's just another, amongst all the other challenges, one we have to face, but we need to.
And why it's so important to move quickly, right? I mean, we've got to address this, and the next president, is going to come in a couple of years, and this has to be dealt with immediately and as a top priority and can't be brushed away. Well, listen, thank you everybody for sticking with us here. It's Word on the Street live Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern. Give us a like, give us a heart, tell your friends about it. Tell folks they can listen to this on any of their favorite podcast streaming services after the fact, and we will see you next week. I will be somewhere else next week.
We are probably going to have Hadi Amr. He said it. So we'll have a former U.S. Special Envoy for to the Palestinians,
right?
Hadi Amr, to talk about the U.S.-Palestinian relationship, which is something we don't spend enough. We always say U.S.-Israel relationship, and we say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but very rarely, if ever, do we say U.S.-Palestinian relationship, and that needs to be part of this equation.
Absolutely. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you next week.